Hi. Many of you likely recognize the benefits of staying well organized, whether it be keeping track of receipts for end-of-year tax purposes or keeping a running list for the grocery store. My guest today has made a profession of being organized, and I'm so glad he has time to sit down with us to talk about how he's been keeping tabs for the people of Plymouth County for over 2 decades. I'm Su Moran, and joining me today on In Your Corner is John Buckley Jr., Plymouth County's Register of Deeds. Elected to the position in 2000, John is a licensed attorney with a deep background in public affairs. He oversees the management of between 150,000 to 300,000 documents a year. Welcome, John.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm so looking forward to this conversation. And I thought I'd start with a couple of background kind of questions.
Sure.
So before you were elected to the position of Register in 2000, you served in a variety of public capacities, including the Plymouth County Board of Commissioners. What drew you to the position?
I always thought I might be in public service. My family had been involved when I was a young child. I remember passing out flyers for my father when he ran for state representative as a little child, 4 years old, 5 years old. So I always have thought that having a job in public service would be a rewarding experience. And over the course of my career, after I graduated from Tufts, I went to work for my congressman in D.C., Brian Donnelly, who was my congressman at the time. I came back to Massachusetts, worked for the Brockton Chamber of Commerce, then took a job as the mayor's chief of staff while I was going to night law school, and did that for a number of years, went off to private practice, got elected to the county commission and served a couple of years as chairman. And when the Register of Deeds position opened up, I ran for it and was elected. So I think all the combination of having been a private attorney, having practiced law, having done all the customer service things from other jobs really qualified me for the job. And thankfully, the voters thought the same way.
You know, as I'm listening to you, I hadn't really realized, I mean, I knew you went to Tufts because I went to Tufts, something I picked up on, but the commonalities that we have in our upbringing in terms of public service, my uncle who was a lawyer was a public defender. I helped my dad, he was wheelchair vet, and I helped him put together the 4th of July Boston celebration, volunteered with that. It's really, for parents, when kids are brought up in the midst of sort of civic service, it becomes something really close at hand, and they feel like they can, really make a difference. So thank you. Thanks for talking about that beginning. I know that you've served in your current role for 2 decades. Could you talk a little bit about changes in the role in the office and just generally the district?
So when I got elected in 2000, it was very much a paper and pen operation. Mm-hmm. The internet had been developed, but a lot of public records and public access to those records weren't finalized. Technology wasn't at that stage yet. When I was a county commissioner, I practiced law in Brockton, and I really pushed the register at the time, a fellow by the name of Jack Reardon, to develop a Brockton satellite office. And the technology had changed that they were able to develop, they called it a T1 line that connected Brockton to Plymouth.
Wow.
And instead of people from Brockton that practiced law in that area, they could go to the Brockton satellite to record their documents.
And for consumers, one of the upsides is that so people realize you're not paying as much because it's less time for the because attorneys' hours are billable and it's more efficient and at hand. So that's a huge development.
Yeah. So the first change was to try to take paper records, turn them into images, and bring them forward so people could search them over the internet. We started with a 50-year title search. That was a state law at the time to try to get to 50 years of access over the internet. We accomplished that, and we just kept going. Plymouth Colony was the foundation of our records. And when the Mayflower arrived in 1620, Plymouth Colony was made up of what is Barnstable County, Bristol County, and Plymouth County. In 1685, the state legislature split them into 3 counties. So our county records go back to 1685. So thankfully, as part of that effort, we've been able to go back to 1685 and get every image up there from 1685, link them to an index, and make them available on the internet. It took a lot of work and a lot of years, but thankfully we've been able to do that.
Herculean task. It's amazing. And as chair of Consumer Protection of the Joint Committee in the Senate, I really appreciate the accessibility aspect of it, because if a family is thinking about refinancing, this may not be the time, but you can, without hiring an attorney, you can go online and get a lot of information. And so that's one of the very friendly pieces about what you've done to open up the office.
But who would have expected at that time that we'd have COVID?
Right.
And that nobody could come in the building for a while. And the lawyers, the closings.
Well, tell me about that.
Well, so during the early days of COVID, we worked split shifts. The registry was always open to record. We had to be open to record, to keep the real estate market flowing. And the fact that we had all our records at that time available online, the title examiners that traditionally came in to do title reports for the lawyers doing the closings were able to do it online. The lawyers that were doing the closings did it by, we had developed electronic recording over the internet by then. We were able to do that by online. Thankfully, we had done that in advance. I can tell you, though, when we started to go back and do all the images, historical images, we never would have expected that's the purpose that would be so successful.
It's so incredible that you were able to pivot that way. I mean, really, so much of commerce would have been stagnated.
Right.
And there's also an element of work that you do for the town. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, our primary role with every town is with the assessor's office, because people have to be taxed at full and fair value. So they have immediate access to go on our system, and weekly, if they choose to do it, bi-weekly, monthly, they can run all the sales within that particular community. And then they can use those sale numbers and those properties that were sold to establish what the actual valuations of individual properties should be.
Well, and that's great information. But I also, kind of along the theme of the consumer again, if, there's an individual that feels like maybe their property is valued too highly for tax purposes,
Right.
because sometimes those are gross amounts of information. And so with the accessibility, homeowners can actually look and say, well, I actually visited this other property that I think my valuation is based on, and I think it should be different. So that's just, again, having that accessibility is so consumer friendly. When you talk about paperwork, you also have a real talent for weaving in history, and I know you're a bit of a history buff. What would you say are some of the most important or unusual records that you've run across?
Well, I've always been interested in history. My family always promoted that when we were children, my brothers and sisters and I. My senior year in high school, at Boston College High School, we could either go to school or do a volunteer project. So I was able to volunteer with the Office of the Boston Bicentennial. This is way back. Wow. I was class of 74 at BC High, and it was in preparation for the bicentennial. And a friend of mine and I were able to go into Boston City Hall every morning and go off and create the first record of plaques and statues in the city of Boston.
To actually be there is incredible.
Yeah. So that further enhanced my interest in history. So when I was elected to the Register of Deeds office, I always thought records tell a story. For individuals, your ownership and your record is extremely important to you, but some records have a story with them.
Especially in Plymouth. It's ground zero for this country's history.
So we started several months after I was elected, we started a notable land record collection, and we've done about 100 since then. So the boyhood home of Rocky Marciano, Daniel Webster's house in Marshfield, many Island Grove Park in Abington, a lot of very famous parks around the county, many properties in Carver. And I work with many of the historical organizations within our communities to bring those forward. And I've had fun with it. And it's been a really nice addition to what I do as register to kind of promote those kind of things. But I can tell you, the one of our 100 that has brought the most attention and the most interest. So when I was elected, we formed a committee of people, title examiners, a couple lawyers for the building to be built. We built in a way that was registry friendly, how the things go, but we also turned them into a display committee. And so I went into my first display committee and said, has anybody heard of the Shall I Go Naked pasture?
I bet some interest was piqued.
It was in the Globe. I had read it years ago. And one of our title examiners that had been there for 50 years said, I know where that is. It's across from the Plymouth Library near Brayley Lane. So the story goes, there was a woman who would come to the street when people walked by begging for alms. And if people said no, she would say, well, shall I go naked? So that reference of hers got into the deed reference. It's actually part of the original deed and part of the plans that you'll follow. Even today, the deed reference to those properties have that in there.
As opposed to a meets and measures bound, it's where this woman physically...
Shall I Go Naked pasture.
Unbelievable.
And wherever I go, whether I talk about Rocky Marciano, Thomas Edison owned property in Brockton, the one that everyone has the most fun with is the Shall I Go Naked pasture.
Well, it brings to like such a concrete picture of the way the records developed and the importance of history.
And how people lived, right?
Exactly. I mean, the fabric of our community right throughout history. Another thing that I think is really important in terms of just really transparency, your office is very integrally involved in records request by the public, also sometimes known as FOIA, Freedom of Information Act. Can you sort of go through the process about the best way for people to find a record under that process?
Well, certainly individually. Let me start individually. Anybody that owns property should have a copy of their deed. And I go around and talk to a lot of the councils on aging, and I said, look, you have a will, you have a power of attorney, a healthcare proxy, you have the package that you should have. You put it in a place that the people that are going to represent you down the road know where that is. Mm-hmm. But you should also have in that package a copy of your deed. Make it easier for people to deal with things, as we all will pass on at some point. So it's very easy for people to get a copy of their deed. It frustrates me to no end when I get these organizations that request group packages of deeds, because there are companies out there that are kind of a semi-scam company that send letters, particularly to the elderly, and anybody out there, beware of those letters that say you really need a copy of your deed, and we can get you one for $95.
Right. Talk about really taking advantage of people.
And you can get a copy of your deed at one of our 3 offices, a main office in Plymouth at 50 Oberry Street, a satellite office in Brockton next to Superior Court, a Rockland satellite office over in Triple A Plaza. You can get a copy for $1 a page. And that is the first public record request that you should be making, is to go and get yourself protected.
So you don't need an attorney. You could just as a everyday person
Individual.
come and visit the registry,
Yeah.
whatever hours are open,
Yeah.
and give your address. Can you do it
Yeah.
just by your address? You don't need
Yeah,
a
well,
book and page.
See, our records are best searched by grantor, grantee. Your name will be able to pull it right up as the owner of the property.
Great. And for $1 a page,
Yeah.
and people do it all the time,
Right.
so it's not like
If-
complicated.
For the broader records, we deal with them on a case-by-case basis, but obviously our records are public. And quite honestly, because everything is available on the internet, we don't have a lot of those requests anymore.
Right.
Companies that need that information just go right to our site.
Right, and just can pull it right off.
Yeah.
What would you say, just looking at the people who service the community in your office? And I remember reading something, I think it was in Old Colony, where you were just heartfelt in calling the public's attention to a lot of folks who work for the municipality and for you, and it really struck me. What would you say were the biggest challenges for staff during COVID, and what was that like?
Well, as I said, we didn't miss a day of recording. We were able to have people remotely work at the time, and we bought the computers to allow them to work from home during that time, and it really worked during COVID. However, we are a very strong customer service operation, and the number of people that just kind of come in, they have a day off, they are retired, they come in during the day and they want help trying to find information about their property. That is the best way we service people, is by being open. But we were able to manage it during COVID and keep real estate moving.
You know, another thing is I know as an attorney, oftentimes there'll be a reference on a deed or a transfer that's a little complicated. And so I know myself, there have been a couple of occasions where I've had to actually speak with the register about what's the best way to do this? How can I find something? What would you say, really two questions. One is, what's kind of the most unusual request, and what's kind of the most common?
Well, there's a lot of requests from people about their property. We also get requests from people trying to do historical research of their house. And the difficult part is you can normally trace it by the grantor-grantee index and go back to a certain time. But if your property has ever gone through probate, you actually have to go in Plymouth across the street to the probate court to get those records to follow the chain of title all the way up.
Because it might have changed in a will,
Right.
for
Might
example,
have been
or
gone out in a
maybe
will.
something went into trust.
Right. So those are the difficult ones for people. They just can't go online and search it that way.
Sure. And what is kind of the most interesting thing that you've come across in this job for you? And you got to probably keep it to 3 or 5, or I bet there are a ton.
Well, the hardest recordings we have, the hardest questions we have relate to beach rights and adverse possession claims.
What's adverse possession
When
for
somebody
people?
owns, many cases, adjoining property, and
So right next to each other.
right next to each other, and they've mowed a piece of lawn over somebody's property or established control of it for 20 years without permission, you can establish your right to that property. And that becomes the most nasty of the fights that we have.
Well, and I can imagine people sometimes, maybe it's sold and someone looks at the cleared lawn and says, well, gee, I thought when I bought this, I owned up to the oak tree.
Right.
What are you saying? The prior owner mowed 10 feet?
But even as an attorney, even easements. there can be easement rights that run over one person's property for the other person's property. And if you don't recognize that you have an easement and you plant a tree that can destroy that line, that sewer line, that
Access.
you can really have some issues and damage.
Well, and if you think about that with respect to public access to beaches,
Right.
when things get planted over and then all of a sudden something becomes more private, then
Yeah.
it's really recorded. There are some, I'm sure you have some interesting cases
Yeah,
there.
so Matt McDonough, who was the Register of Probate, was a selectman in the town of Marshfield. And Jim Cantwell, the former
Who's now with Senator
who's now with
Markey.
Senator Markey,
Yep.
also remembers how there was a tremendous lawsuit in Wrexham, part of Marshfield, about beach rights. And they used our records that went back into the 1800s to establish the rights of those people to continue to access the beach. A lot of times people will buy a property near the water and they'll put up a fence or a gate and try to limit people's access. And many times they're established by right in documents. Many times they're just prescriptive rights.
And so when you say prescriptive, it's kind of like usage.
Yes, you used it over time and established it as access point and continuously used it. And those go to the land court, and they're very complicated cases, but they are our toughest cases.
I can imagine. Now, are you allowed to testify to sort of verify a document or something like that?
Normally, when our records are brought into a lawsuit with a district attorney on fraud cases or civil cases, we'll be able to just certify that those are our records and they're accepted and agreed by both parties to be admitted.
So you can it gets like a stamp and says,
yes.
The registry
Instead
has said this
testify
is
to everyone
true and accurate.
That these are our true and accurate records.
Okay.
Instead of me saying it, they take the stamp.
Good, because that would
Right.
talk about complications. Yeah. So as it stands, tell me what how the time is divided right now in terms of the way the registry works, as far as how much is kind of just public service, how much is outreach. I know you do a lot of education.
So basically, my job is to manage the Registry of Deeds, oversee the recording of records, making sure that those records get imaged so people can find them, making sure that we have a correct index so people can actually find the documents. One thing to have millions of documents recorded, you have to be able to find it by a grantor or grantee system, and microfilmed. Over my years, we've had to modify state law in terms of being able to do the modernization efforts.
Oh, right.
At one point, we were bringing in actual books of all the books that were recorded. The number of books recorded in my term exceeded everyone together back to the 1685 in a few years, because mortgages are now can be 30 pages.
Wow.
So we were able to get the legislature to agree that a virtual copy is sufficient, and have it available as an online copy was sufficient to meet that standard.
And it saved, I'm sure, staff headaches and time and money for your consumers.
Yeah, we were able to do. So we also were able to do. At one point there was a statute that allowed a document to be considered recorded when it was dropped off at the step of the registry, and that goes back to old times. So we were able to change that, particularly during that 2003 and 2004 refinance boom.
Oh.
And we couldn't get everything on record, right away.
Right.
So a book was only deemed recorded, was assigned, a document was only recorded when it was assigned a book and page number or certificate number on the land court side. Those kind of legislative changes have been enormous, and that's part of my job, is to go to the State House and advocate for that. And relative to foreclosures, we had a tremendous problem with foreclosures in 2008. So with the help of legislators over many years, we were able to change some of those statutes to help protect people.
Well, and I think that's probably the most important thing is really how important accuracy is,
Right.
and the fact that it's the final proof. I mean, this is actual
Right.
ownership, and to have a system where it can be proven, and it's just incredible. Let me just as I'm listening to you, what do you think, in just a little bit broader, in looking at Plymouth over the years in your career of 20 years, what do you say are the best changes that have taken place?
Well, thankfully, when Governor Romney increased fees instead of increasing taxes, he allowed us a technology fee. And the register collected on every document. Without that, we never would have been able to do our modernization efforts. And those fees and that fund was what allowed us to go back to 1685. It allowed us to do the kind of things that we've had to use outside sources to do that in many cases. That was probably the hardest thing that we did. When the bill originally came out, we were collecting it as a county for the state registers.
Sure, right.
And we had to fight pretty hard. Thankfully, Terry Murray was chairman of Ways and Means, and John Rogers was chairman of the House Ways and Means at the time, also from Norwood. So they really stood up for us and helped us sort that out. And since then, we've been able to have the money available to make all those changes. That was a key improvement for us. We wouldn't have had the money to do that strictly with county fees.
It's so smart to attach it directly
Right.
to the need.
Right.
I want to just kind of close by telling you how really appreciative I am to kind of have the history and let people watch this show so that they understand the way things work, and especially the fact that it's a service, it's transparent, it's accessible, and that's all due to your efforts in America's first community of Plymouth. So thank you for appearing on the show. This has been quite enjoyable. Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I want to thank John Buckley again for coming. Those interested in learning more about the role of the Plymouth County Register of Deeds can visit the department's website, www.plymouthdeeds.org. John also does a deep dive into the behind the scenes of his job on his own PAC TV show, Register's Report, which airs monthly. As always, my office remains an open resource for anyone who may need assistance. We can be reached by phone at 617-722-1330 or by emailing me at susan.moran@masenate.gov. Thank you all for watching today. I'm Senator Moran, and I'll be in your corner.